The Rise of Nationalism in Europe. The story starts with a print prepared by Frederick Sorio in 1848. The dream of worldwide democratic and social republics, the pact between nations. It shows men and women of all ages and social classes, marching in a long train, and offering homage to the Statue of Liberty as they pass by it. In Sorio's utopian vision, the people of the world are grouped as distinct nations, identified through their flags and national costume. This chapter will deal with many of the issues visualized by Sorio, and will look at the diverse processes through which nation-states and nationalism came into being in 19th century Europe. The French Revolution and the idea of the nation. The first clear expression of nationalism came with the French Revolution in 1789. Led to the execution of Louis XVI in January 1793, and an extended period of political turmoil. From the very beginning, the French revolutionaries introduced various measures and practices that could create a sense of collective identity amongst the French people. With the outbreak of the Revolutionary Wars, the French armies began to carry the idea of nationalism abroad. Through a return to monarchy, Napoleon had, no doubt, destroyed democracy in France, but in the administrative field he had incorporated revolutionary principles in order to make the whole system more rational and efficient. The Civil Code of 1804, usually known as the Napoleonic Code, did away with all privileges based on birth, established equality before the law and secured the right to property. But the initial enthusiasm soon turned to hostility, as it became clear that the new administrative arrangements did not go hand in hand with political freedom. Increased taxation, censorship, forced conscription into the French armies required to conquer the rest of Europe, all seemed to outweigh the advantages of the administrative changes. Now, people began to oppose Napoleonic rule. Napoleon here is represented as a postman on his way back to France, after he lost the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. Each letter dropping out of his bag bears the names of the territories he lost. The making of nationalism in Europe. If you look at the map of mid-18th century Europe, you will find that there were no nation-states as we know them today. So, how did nationalism and the idea of the nation-state emerge? Industrialization began in England in the second half of the 18th century, but in France and parts of the German states it occurred only during the 19th century. Before 19th century, there existed two major social groups, namely aristocracy, which was a dominant class, and peasantry, which was a literate class with larger population. New middle class or commercial class emerged after industrialization. It consisted of big businessmen, industrialists, and workers. It was among the educated, liberal middle classes that ideas of national unity following the abolition of aristocratic privileges gained popularity. A new conservatism after 1815. In 1815, representatives of the European powers, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, who had collectively defeated Napoleon, met at Vienna to draw up a settlement for Europe. The Congress was hosted by the Austrian Chancellor Duke Metternich. He was a conservative and wanted to re-establish autocracy over Europe. The delegates drew up the Treaty of Vienna of 1815 with the object of undoing most of the changes that had come about in Europe during the Napoleonic Wars. The Bourbon dynasty, which had been deposed during the French Revolution, was restored to power. And France lost the territories it had annexed under Napoleon. A series of states were set up on the boundaries of France to prevent French expansion future. Thus, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, which included Belgium, was set up in the north and Genoa was added to Piedmont in the south. Prussia was given important new territories on its western frontiers, while Austria was given control of northern Italy. But the German Confederation of 39 states that had been set up by Napoleon was left untouched. Conservative regimes set up in 1815 were autocratic. They did not tolerate criticism and dissent, and sought to curb activities that questioned the legitimacy of autocratic governments. Most of them imposed censorship laws to control what was said in newspapers, books, plays and songs, and reflected the ideas of liberty and freedom associated with the French Revolution. The revolutionaries. During the years following 1815, the fear of repression drove many liberal nationalists underground. Secret societies sprang up in many European states to train revolutionaries and spread their ideas. One such revolutionary was Giuseppe Mazzini. Founded two secret societies. 1. Young Italy in Marseilles. 2. Young Europe in Bern. Mazzini's relentless opposition to monarchy and his vision of democratic republics frightened the conservatives. Metternich described him as the most dangerous enemy of our social order. The Age of Revolutions, 1830 to 1848. As conservative regimes tried to consolidate their power, liberalism and nationalism came to be increasingly associated with revolution in many regions of Europe. First Revolt. The first upheaval took place in France in July 1830. The Bourbon kings who had been restored to power during the conservative reaction after 1815 were now overthrown by liberal revolutionaries who installed a constitutional monarchy with Louis Philippe at its head. When France sneezes, Metternich once remarked, the rest of Europe catches cold. Second Revolt. Revolution in Brussels. The July Revolution sparked an uprising in Brussels, which led to Belgium breaking away from the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. Third Revolt. Revolution in Greece. The growth of revolutionary nationalism in Europe sparked off a struggle for independence amongst the Greeks which began in 1821. Poets and artists lauded Greece as the cradle of European civilization and mobilized public opinion to support its struggle against a Muslim empire. The English poet Lord Byron organized funds and later went to fight in the war, where he died of fever in 1824. Finally, the Treaty of Constantinople of 1832 recognized Greece as an independent nation. The Romantic imagination and national feeling. The development of nationalism did not come about only through wars and territorial expansion. It also developed from various aspects mentioned ahead. Culture and language played an important role in creating the idea of the nation. Art and poetry, stories and music helped express and shape nationalist feelings. Many romantics and philosophers are responsible for creating nationalism by mobilizing local tales, hymns, national songs, etc. German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder claimed that true German culture was to be discovered among the common people, das Volk. It was through folk songs, folk poetry and folk dances that the true spirit of the nation, Volksgeist, was popularized. Karol Kerpinski celebrated the national struggle through his operas and music, turning folk dances like the Polonaise and Mazurka into nationalist symbols. Hunger, hardship and popular revolt. The 1830s were years of great economic hardship in Europe. The first half of the 19th century saw an enormous increase in population all over Europe. In most countries there were more seekers of jobs than employment. The rise of food prices or a year of bad harvest led to widespread pauperism in town and country. Livelihood of people came into danger. Fourth Revolt. Weavers in Silesia. Earlier, in 1845, weavers in Silesia had led a revolt against contractors who supplied them raw material and gave them orders for finished textiles, but drastically reduced their payments. The journalist Wilhelm Wolff described the events in a Silesian village that, on June 4 at 2 p.m. a large crowd of weavers emerged from protested to the mansion of their contractor demanding higher wages. The contractor fled with his family to a neighboring village, returned 24 hours later having requisitioned the army. In the exchange that followed, 11 weavers were shot. Fifth Revolt. France 1848. After a long period of hunger, hardship and revolts, the population of Paris went out on the roads. Barricades were erected and Louis Philippe was forced to flee. National Assembly proclaimed a republic, granted suffrage to all adult males above 21, and guaranteed the right to work. Sixth Revolt. 1848, the Revolution of the Liberals. Men and women of the liberal middle classes combined their demands for constitutionalism with national unification. They took advantage of the growing popular unrest to push their demands for the creation of a nation-state on parliamentary principles, a constitution, freedom of the press and freedom of association. On May 18, 1848, a large crowd of these people gathered in Frankfurt City and voted for all German National Assembly. They drafted a constitution for a German nation to be headed by a monarchy subject to a parliament. 831 elected representatives marched in a festive procession to take their places in the Frankfurt Parliament convened in the Church of St. Paul. When the deputies offered the crown on these terms to Friedrich Wilhelm IV, King of Prussia, he rejected it and joined other monarchs to oppose the elected assembly. The opposition of the aristocracy and military became stronger, the social basis of parliament eroded. The parliament was dominated by the middle classes, who resisted the demands of workers and artisans and consequently lost their support. In the end, troops were called in, and the assembly was forced to disband. The making of Germany and Italy. Can the army be the architect of a nation? After 1848, nationalism in Europe moved away from its association with democracy and revolution. nationalist sentiments were often mobilized by conservatives like monarchy, military, and the Junkers, for promoting state power and achieving political domination over Europe. Seventh Revolt. Unification of Germany. Chief Minister, Otto von Bismarck, was the architect of this process carried out with the help of the Prussian army and bureaucracy. 3 wars over 7 years, with Austria, Denmark and France, ended in Prussian victory and completed the process of unification. In January 1871, the Prussian king, William I, was proclaimed German emperor in a ceremony held at Versailles. Otto von Bismarck gathered in the unheated Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles to proclaim the new German Empire headed by Kaiser William I of Prussia. The nation-building process in Germany had demonstrated the dominance of Prussian state power. The new state placed a strong emphasis on modernizing the currency, banking, legal and judicial systems in Germany. Prussian measures and practices often became a model for the rest of Germany. 8. Revolt. Unification of Italy. Like Germany, Italy too had a long history of political fragmentation. Italians were scattered over several dynastic states, as well as the multinational Habsburg Empire. Italy was divided into 7 states, of which only one, Sardinia-Piedmont, was ruled by an Italian princely house. The north was under Austrian Habsburgs, the center was ruled by the Pope, and the southern regions were under the domination of the Bourbon kings of Spain. Even the Italian language had not acquired one common form, and still had many regional and local variations. During the 1830s, Giuseppe Mazzini had sought to put together a coherent program for a unitary Italian republic. He had also formed a secret society called Young Italy for the dissemination of his goals. The failure of revolutionary uprisings both in 1831 and 1848 meant that the mantle now fell on Sardinia-Piedmont under its ruler King Victor Emmanuel II to unify the Italian states through war. Through a tactful diplomatic alliance with France engineered by Chief Minister Cavour, Sardinia-Piedmont succeeded in defeating the Austrian forces in 1859. Apart from regular troops, a large number of armed volunteers under the leadership of Giuseppe Garibaldi joined the fray. In 1860, they marched into South Italy and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies and succeeded in winning the support of the local peasants in order to drive out the Spanish rulers. In 1861, Victor Emmanuel II was proclaimed King of United Italy. 9th Revolt. The strange case of Britain. In Britain, the formation of the nation-state was not the result of a sudden upheaval or revolution. It was the result of a long drawn-out process. There was no British nation prior to the 18th century. The primary identities of the people who inhabited the British Isles were ethnic ones, such as English, Welsh, Scot, or Irish. All of these ethnic groups had their own cultural and political traditions. But as the English nation steadily grew in wealth, importance and power, it was able to extend its influence over the other nations of the islands. The English Parliament, which had seized power from the monarchy in 1688 at the end of a protracted conflict, was the instrument through which a nation-state, with England at its center, came to be forged. The Act of Union, 1707, between England and Scotland that resulted in the formation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain meant, in effect, that England was able to impose its influence on Scotland. Then the Great Britain forcibly established the dominance over Ireland, suppressing their culture and tradition, and formed the United Kingdom in 1801. Visualizing the nation. Artists in the 18th and 19th centuries found a way out by personifying a nation. In other words, they represented a country as if it were a person. Nations were then portrayed as female figures. The female form that was chosen to personify the nation did not stand for any particular woman in real life. Rather, it sought to give the abstract idea of the nation a concrete form. That is, the female figure became an allegory of the nation. In France, she was christened Marianne, a popular Christian name, which underlined the idea of a people's nation. Her characteristics were drawn from those of liberty and the republic, the red cap, the tricolor, the cockade. Similarly, Germania became the allegory of the German nation. In visual representations, Germania wears a crown of oak leaves, as the German oak stands for heroism, nationalism and imperialism. By the last quarter of the 19th century, nationalism became a narrow creed with limited ends. During this period, nationalist groups became increasingly intolerant of each other and ever ready to go to war. 10th Revolt. Consequences which led to World War I. The Balkans was a region of geographical and ethnic variation, whose inhabitants were broadly known as the Slavs. A large part of the Balkans was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. The Balkan peoples based their claims for independence, or political rights on nationality, and used history to prove that they had once been independent, but had subsequently been subjugated by foreign powers. During this period, there was intense rivalry among the European powers over trade and colonies as well as naval and military might. These rivalries were very evident in the way the Balkan problem unfolded. This led to a series of wars in the region and finally the First World War. Summary. Nationalism, aligned with imperialism, led Europe to disaster in 1914. But meanwhile, many countries in the world which had been colonized by the European powers began to oppose imperial domination. The idea that society should be organized into nation-states came to be accepted as natural and universal.